Well, good evening, everybody. We'll just make a start. You're all very welcome. I'm Helen McVeigh, as you all know, as most of you know, and I'm the convener of the Classical Association in Northern Ireland. And I'm really delighted to welcome you this evening to this virtual event. And it's wonderful. I know we have some people who aren't in the British Isles, who are in different time zones. So good evening, good afternoon. It's great to see you here. And under more usual circumstances, we'd be meeting at Queen's University in Belfast. But because of the current situation, obviously, we're here gathering together virtually. And of course, this has its advantages because we've been able to open the event to a much wider audience. And you're all most welcome. So a couple of little housekeeping. Before we start, could I ask you to mute your microphones? Just so, you know, we don't have dogs barking or anything in the background. And, you know, my dog is sniffing under the door as we speak. And the session's being recorded, just to let you know, make you aware of that. And because of the nature of this event, I'm going to be questioning our guest, interrogating our guest. So perhaps if you want to change your view to speaker view, it's up at the top right. You can have gallery view or speaker view. If you want to see everyone, you can have gallery view, but speaker view might be better. And if you wish to mute your microphones, that is down bottom left. You just hit the mute button. Well, this is a Classical Association in Northern Ireland event. And under the normal circumstances, whatever normal is, we would have a full programme of events planned. But in their place, we have organised a number of virtual events. So we have this event, this conversation this evening with our guest, Michael Hughes. We have another event in December. We have a lecture from Dr. Kerry Phelan of Maynooth University. And I'll keep you in touch with the details about that. And we're also hoping to produce a series of webinars featuring early career researchers, and that's all happening behind the scenes. But back to today, and I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, Dr. Michael Hughes. Now, Michael was born in County Armagh in Northern Ireland, so he's a local man, but he now lives in London. And he studied English at Oxford, and he has a PhD from London Metropolitan University. He has also studied acting in Paris, and lately he has been in the Chernobyl miniseries and also the Marcella, the crime drama. And at present he lectures in creative writing at Queen Mary University in London. So he's here to talk about his novel Country, and I have my copy here. I've been eagerly rereading it over the last week. It's a novel that explores the Northern Irish Troubles, and it's inspired by Homer's Iliad. Now, it was awarded the 2018 London Hellenic Prize for the best original work inspired by Greek culture. It's a fantastic read. I would urge anybody to have a look at it. But as Michael said himself today on Twitter, this is the perfect audience because the Classical Association in Northern Ireland, we are sadly familiar with the Troubles, and we're also familiar with the other side. Welcome, Michael. I'm just going to change my view here to speaker view. Okay, welcome, Michael. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen, for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Good to see you. I have some questions for you. So the first, actually, before we begin, you've very kindly said you'll take questions from the audience, and if anyone thinks of anything during the talk, you could type it into the chat, or if you wish to wait to the end. Michael, did you want to read us something from the novel first?
I will indeed, Helen. I thought I would read the opening. The first chapter. The novel's in very short chapters. It's just about two and a half pages. 5 or 6 minutes to read, and it'll give a flavour of the novel, the voice of the novel, the tone of the novel, and also for those, I always say for those who know the Iliad, I'm sure the level of acquaintance here is better than average. You begin to see some of the way the novel works in retelling that story and playing off the original. So I've got my copy here too. I'll open it up and just read the first chapter.
Thank you.
Fury, pure fury. The blood was up, lost the head completely. Achill, the man from the West, the best sniper the IRA ever seen. All called him Achill, but his name was plain Liam O'Brien, after the Da, big Liam O'Brien, who came out of Achill Island and bore the name before him. So the son was called Achill in his turn, though he was born and reared in Castle Bar, and he'd never set foot in the place, for the Da always said it was a fearful hole. What was the start of it? The whole wrecking match that sent so many strong souls roaring down to hell, dogs chewing up the guts ground into the road, birds pecking at the splattered bits of their brains, the way London wanted it to go, the way it always is. Here's what. Pig and Achill fell out. The OC and the trigger man. Bad, bad news. And whose fault was that? Here's who. One particular prod farmer from up the country, a man all knew as Crisis Cunningham, who owned the land where they were prepping the job that Pig had been renting since the ceasefire was called. 96 this was, the year just turned. The farmer motored down to get back his daughter, for the girl had disgraced him by running away and flinging herself at Pig after he called into the house to settle his account the week before. She was shacked up now at his place, doing his washing, cooking his dinner, whatever else. So this man Cunningham sent word to Pig and his brother Dog, and he was told to come on down to the farm for a wee chat. The whole squad gathered to hear, round the side of the barn, ducked in under the jut of the roof in case a chopper went over, stamping away the cold, puffing into their hands. The old man said his piece, laid it all out. The whole recitation of his credentials and bona fides. No interest in politics of any colour or creed. You pays your money and no questions asked. But he knew better than to frig around with lads the like of them. He hadn't come empty-handed, no sir. A bag full of cash for Pig, big bundles of sterling 20s, English notes, the keys to his own Merc, the promise of a prize bull once the next season was done, worth 10 or 12 grand itself. Then it started. The man begged, he plain begged for the young one back, weeping and whining, down on his knees in the wet dung of the yard. She's hardly 14, the light of my life. Please don't touch her, big man, not yet a while. Give her a couple more years to be a wee girl. I buried her mother and my mother both this past year. The heart is already tore out of me. I can't stand losing the last bit of joy I have. Nobody knew where to look. It would scunder you to see a big man like yon choking on his sobs and snotters. They all nudged other and the mutter went round. Go on there, Pig. Let the girl go back home with her da and we'll have no more said about it. Not Pig. He laughed his big dirty laugh right in the poor man's face. Away and shite. I take no orders from muck savage orange bastards. The girl stays where she is and she'll be doing my ironing and plenty besides till her pubes turn grey if I want her to. Now get the fuck out of this before you're carried out. He drew his short, snapped off the safety, and away the old man skedaddled, hoofing it down the back lane at a fair old lick. But the minute he got in home, he lifted the phone to a certain individual. You know I take no sides, he says, and I never ask for nothing. But family is family, and I bring in the vote for you here in the town land every election. So this one time, there's a wee favour you can maybe do for me.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So what made you decide to write a novel about the Troubles based on the Iliad?
Well, the original intention was to write a novel about the Troubles, about the conflict. My first novel had been set in London. It was set in a few different periods of history, and there were no Irish characters at all. I was living in London. I'd very much decided that nothing in my origins and background was going to be my subject as a writer. But after that first novel came and went, I rethought that and began to start to try to find a way into the context I grew up in as a subject for fiction. And I wrote a lot that was maybe close to my own experience, and about someone like me who'd come from a place like that and trying to come to terms with what all that meant. And I didn't get very far with it. I wrote a lot of stuff, but I couldn't make it work. And I began to look for another way in, and realized that the sort of the elephant in the room was the conflict itself and the people who were actually involved in the violence. Now, I had no direct experience of that, and to the best of my knowledge, nobody close to me did either. So I was looking around for a way into that subject and a way to write about violence and that sort of violence. I realized, I suppose, that what I was trying to do was trying to write a war novel, in a sense, but about the Northern Ireland conflict. And being a sort of a bookish sort of person, I tried to read my way into the subject, and I thought, right, I'll get the sort of classic war narratives. And I just went shopping, and I got, All Quiet on the Western Front and Catch-22 and For Whom the Bell Tolls, and a stack of war novels, and among them I had the Iliad. I thought, let's start there. That's the daddy of them all, and that's the one that sits behind every war narrative, really. I had read it many years ago, around sort of student days, and kind of once, I think, since then, but I didn't know it well. I didn't feel I was on top of it, and I thought I'll use that as my starting point. And I suppose the truth is I didn't really get any further. I'd got about sort of 5 or 6 books into the Iliad and thought, everything I could possibly want to say on the subject is here. Mm-hmm. And I began to get this scent really in my nostrils of a book that could use some of that to explore not the conflict literally, but the dynamics of the conflict. That was so. That's a long answer to a simple question, which is to say that I wasn't trying to write a version of the Iliad to do it.
So sorry, I'm being told my network bandwidth is low. I don't know if that has any impact on everyone else. We'll keep going.
I can hear you fine, Helen.
Okay. So my next question was, what were your experiences growing up? But you've said that you didn't have any experiences of the Troubles. So, how did you know what to write about, the British on one side and the IRA on the other? Look,
I wouldn't say no experiences. I mean, I don't think any of us who grew up in that time and place. I grew up through the 70s and 80s, quite near the border in a town called Katy. Many of you know, it's a very strongly majority Catholic town, massive army base at the top of my street growing up. The usual, I don't need to explain the context of this audience, the usual checkpoints and soldiers. There wasn't a huge amount of it wasn't somewhere that came up on the news very often, mm-hmm. but the odd time it did. And you were very aware of the trappings of the conflict and the texture of everyday life in that time and place. I meant that I didn't have any direct experience of violence, and I didn't know the conflict, certainly on the Republican side, from the inside in any way at all. My parents were very moderate nationalist people, and very careful, I think, to keep us away from that, and did that successfully. Really, when it came to try to write about it, I had 2 anxieties really. One was about fictionalizing real events, because quite often in fiction about the conflict, people will take a real incident, like the Shankill Butchers and Resurrection Man. There are plenty of other examples, and they'll fictionalize that, and they'll change names, but everybody knows what they're getting at, and they'll do it. And I've no disrespect to anyone who does that, but I didn't feel comfortable doing that. I felt queasy about exploiting essentially the grief and pain of real people that's still very much alive just for the sake of a book. I didn't want to go there. And on the other hand, I was kind of very conscious that the conflict itself is quite circumscribed. It's a certain series of events which happened in a certain order. And if you make up something completely new, even if it fits within the parameters of how the conflict operated, it doesn't belong there, because we know that didn't happen. Those of us who are connected with that conflict, and it's too small, it's too local, it's too limited in a sense, and I didn't feel comfortable doing that either. So the idea of taking a myth or a mythic structure meant that I was leaning on a story that's available to everybody and saying, this isn't real. I'm not saying this happened, but that doesn't mean it's not true. And it means I can try to use that, as I say, to explore the dynamics of the conflict, to explore, I suppose my sort of instinct was, my hunch was, that the nature of armed conflict and what it does involved sort of initial to begin with, the idea was that I would just take a couple of incidents from the Iliad and spin a novel around those, which would very much be of my own invention. And there are traces of that in the finished novel. The character of Nellie, who's a sort of version of Helen, is very much my own invention. And there are a couple of other relatively long scenes that are extrapolated from very small incidents in the Iliad. But as I went on working on it, and the idea there was that nobody would really know. If you knew the Iliad well, you might sense the shape of it under the landscape, but it wouldn't be a retelling in the way it finally became. But the more I engaged with the Iliad, the more I engaged with what seemed to me to be a very local conflict among groups of people who were strongly connected, who knew each other and knew each other's people and knew the landscape they were in. And I became quite seduced by the resonances there were, and almost addicted to the process of finding correspondences and finding sometimes quite a serious, engaged way, sometimes quite a playful way, ways to make them talk to each other, ways for me to bounce off the Iliad. And there were some things you just don't bother dealing with and leave there. There were some other bits that maybe were more difficult to bring into that setting, but I became quite excited about the idea of how can I make this work? You know, the gods is the big one. A lot of modern retellings of the Iliads just ditch the gods completely. And I was determined not to do that. I was determined to make that work. And also something like the funeral games for Patroclus at the end, which is sort of, by modern sort of narrative sensibilities, you don't want to get to that point in the story and then have it stop for a big sort of circus. You know, you want to get on with, but that's what he does. That's what happens. That's what we got. So I thought, okay, how do we make sense of that? How do we address it? So I enjoyed, as a writer, I enjoyed the process of making those things work, and it became much more of a close retelling than I originally intended.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, personally, I enjoyed reading it and connecting the characters in country with the characters in the Iliad and referring back to the Iliad. And, you know, it made me laugh. I know it's a very serious subject matter, but it was enjoyable to do that. But I wanted to ask you, who did you write the novel for? I mean, is it for classicists who will recognize the characters, or is it for the people in Northern Ireland who witnessed the Troubles, or someone who knows nothing about either?
You know, that's a great question. And the truth is, it certainly wasn't for classicists. I should point out, I am no kind of classical scholar. I haven't a word of Greek. I have very rusty bits and pieces of Latin. And my acquaintance with is very secondhand with classical culture, civilization. So I'm not a classicist, and I was scared of classicist reading it. I really was. I have to say, my experience of those I'm aware of, a couple of reviewers and people I've spoken to, is they've been the most generous and open in their enthusiasm for it, or their willingness to sort of go where I was, because I was taking on, you know, one of the huge monoliths of world culture, and something that people can feel very possessive of and belongs to them and close to their hearts. So I was really worried about that. The classicists would rear up and take it the wrong way, or feel put out in some way by it. I suppose I wanted it to work on two levels. I wanted it to work for people who didn't know much about Northern Ireland and about those years. They would have seen the headlines, have a sense of what was going on, but I wanted to give people a look inside. And again, it's imagined. I don't have that experience, but I wanted in particular to give them a look at the conflict through the eyes of those who were actually doing it. And not really, with the exception of Nellie possibly, but not really, so often novels or films or TV dramas about the Troubles give you a character who stands outside it and represents the viewer or the reader and allows you to pass moral judgment and say, look at those awful people. It might be a journalist or a police or somebody who's walked away from it and is, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted everybody to be implicated and the reader to get their hands very dirty, reading this and seeing it through their eyes. So that was part of my intention. But for people who do know the history very well and the politics very well, I suppose my best, highest ambition, if you like, was that it might complicate their understanding a bit. Whatever they thought they knew, it might throw a little bit of extra light on that or throw up another side to it. And I have to say, I did an awful lot of reading into the politics, the history, into memoirs of those involved, into the details of the procedural details on both sides, more on the Republican side. For those who haven't read the novel, I should say that the Greeks loosely map onto an IRA unit sort of near the border, and the Trojans are kind of represented by the British Army in their base, and it doesn't really go any further than that. It touches on other bits of the conflict, but it's essentially between the IRA and the army. And I suppose in the longer run, and this might be hubris of me to say this, but I suppose I still when I read certain classics, both with small and large C, can find them quite intimidating and quite difficult to approach, to know how to read, to know how to make sense of them. And I suppose my greatest ambition for this novel in the classical world would be that someone who doesn't really understand the Iliad or know how to read it, or just is bewildered by it, if they read this novel, they might then feel a bit more primed to get what the Iliad is, of how to approach it just as a story, and as a world.
Okay, thank you. Right, my next question then is about the homeric devices in the Iliad. They've been orally transmitted, and I was wondering, how far did you consider those devices for country? I mean, I noticed things like you often in the Iliad, after a speech, you have "so he spoke," and you had that. I mean, maybe that is just something that we say in Northern Ireland, it's something that I really enjoyed was, well, it's not really a homeric device. I enjoyed that they're always feeding each other, and that's.
Well, I was feeding lots of food. Absolutely, I wasn't going to skimp on the food, and the feast and the stopping for food was very important, and it fitted well, Mm-hmm. And the speeches, the standing up and saying, now everybody I have something to say here, and getting up and saying it. And one of the first times I was asked to speak about the novel was alongside Pat Barker, who just published, to my horror, published her own retelling of the Iliad at the same time, The Silence of the Girls. And she talked about setting that or hearing that in the voice. She's from the northeast of England, in the local voice there, and she felt she had to have very terse, short exchanges between these men, because that's what she heard in the context she grew up in. She couldn't go for the big, long, garrulous speeches. I had no problem with that. I heard those voices speaking in that way. The orality, again, my knowledge of the scholarship is very sketchy, but my understanding of the oral transmission of the Iliad was something I wanted to reproduce in the voice the novel is told in. It's a third person voice. It doesn't belong to any character, but it's a local voice. It's a voice of the place, and it's a voice that's speaking. It's a voice that's telling you a story, and telling you a story in the language of these people. And I wanted it to sound like something you were listening to, hearing aloud. And then there were little things like the sort of epithets that the characters would I really chimed with me with nicknames. You know, nicknames were a big thing when I was at school, and they were a big thing in small communities. And so the fact that the characters all have these occasionally quite elaborate nicknames was fun. There's that phrase that keeps coming up again and again in the Iliad, and it's translated variously, but most commonly I think as "his words had wings." You know, that comes out every so often. Someone will speak and it'll say "his words had wings," and I know people discuss what that means or what that was supposed to suggested by that. And I thought I'll try and hang on to that, and I translated that phrase as "the words came flying out of him," which I throw in and use occasionally at a particularly big speech. Not quite as often as Homer does, but I liked those little Easter eggs, you know, that are there for people who know the thing well, and I could sort of let them have put some pleasure in the reading pleasure of that in another level.
Okay. My next question was a very general one. How important do you think the reception of ancient literature and culture is today?
I mean, it's something I wish I'd been taught more earlier, and even at university. I did. You said I went to Oxford, and there were many of the fellow students around me who maybe came out of an education or a family life or a culture where that was part of their upbringing and a natural part of their reading and their cultural landscape. It wasn't for me, partly because, you know, that ground was taken by Cuchulainn and Finn McCool and those other sorts of stories I grew up with. And there were bits and pieces of it. I heard about the Trojan horse and Helen of Troy and, you know, ideas of that. But when I first read the Iliad, in fact, when I finished a degree in English, like I said, very old-fashioned degree in English that started with Anglo-Saxon, the Wanderer, the Seafarer, Beowulf, I went through sort of almost century by century to the present day, which stopped in about 1940. I realized that by the end of that degree that there were three things I should have read before I started, which were the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Bible. Although I grew up in a religious family, being Catholics, we'd never read the Bible. You know, that wasn't encouraged at all. You know? The Iliad and the Odyssey, I just saw them under so much of what I was reading, especially in you know, the 16th, 17th, 18th century stuff, and on into the 19th and 20th. Those characters, those myths, those ideas, and the first thing I did when I finished university was read the Iliad and the Odyssey. Earlier, but I'm very much an amateur. I'm not even an amateur. I'm just a dabbler, really. And what I will say is that when I've talked about this book in Ireland and in England, there's been a slightly different response. I think in England, it's been taken as a retelling of the Iliad, and people have thought, I wonder why he said it in Northern Ireland. In Ireland, it's been taken as a book about the Troubles, and people have said, I wonder why he's used the Iliad. So that's been a difference I've noticed.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I think that the fact that you have written this book shows that this ancient literature is still so relevant today. And you know that you can read that, and I read it and believed that all those things happened in your novel, and you know they are based on this ancient story. And I think it's brilliant that you have done that, and you've brought it up to date, and you've made it so relevant to something that means such a lot to people in Northern Ireland. Now, you had said in another interview that I watched that there was a significant character that you decided to remove, and I was just very curious. Could you tell us who it was and on which character in the Iliad they were based, if you remember?
Yeah, I will indeed. And to introduce that, my answer to that, I'll explain a little bit about the process of writing the book. It initially was quite a bit longer. And I showed it to my agent, who had his own thoughts, and then I sent it to the publisher, who had already agreed to publish it. My first book, after my first book, he'd agreed to publish what I wrote next, which was this. And he had a lot to say about the first draft. and one of it was that there was too much sort of plot going on the British side behind the scenes. There was a lot of skullduggery. There was a lot of so the big character who was dropped was a sort of military intelligence person who pops up in the army base and pulls a lot of strings and is constantly sort of playing both sides off each other, and is quite a shady, odd sort of character. Now, that doesn't map as directly as some of the other characters onto the Iliad, but that was the character started out as a version of Aeneas, the Iliad's Aeneas, who's a very different Aeneas than we get later on from Virgil. But that was the character who sort of bit the dust, and a few sort of essential plot bits and dialogue bits got redistributed among some of the other characters, but that was who that was.
Okay, now I enjoyed I'm just enjoying talking to you about this, and I really enjoyed. I got a laugh out of the characters. You know, we have Jack, who's obviously Ajax, but he's called something else. Then there's the other Jack, and it's just wonderful.
That's right.
Well,
you know, it is, and I think, although you say it's a serious book and it's a serious subject, but I did want to have fun with it, and I did want to have, you know, I enjoy that when I'm reading, and I wanted it to be fun and funny, and especially for a local readership who have occasionally a more left field sense of humor than others. I thought that I would enjoy that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So finally, Michael, what's next for you as a novelist, or as an actor, or a lecturer, whatever? Do you want to tell us what's next?
Well, thanks, Helen. You mentioned my sort of parallel life as an actor. I worked as an actor more or less after I left university, all the way up, and still do occasionally under a different name. As an actor, I go by Michael Colgan, just because there was another Michael Hughes in the union and I couldn't use the name. And I haven't done very much there recently. No one has for the last few months. So the series you mentioned, Marcella, will pop up on Netflix and on ITV at some point in the near future, I think. As a writer, I'm beginning to. After Country, I thought, okay, and this is exactly what happened after Blake and Jack the Ripper and the Millennium Bug. You know, a very different book, and again, wildly far from my own experience. Now I thought, I'll write something based on my own experience, and I started, and that didn't work, and I ended up writing Country. And after Country, I thought, I'm going to write something that's back sort of in my own life, a bit more every day, a bit more, and I spent some time on that, and that didn't work again. So I'm digging this time into family history, and I have an ancestor who emigrated to America in the 1860s and was involved in some sort of a labor unrest and other events over there, and is an interesting character who pops up a lot in history books, has been written about a fair bit historically in different ways, but I think there might be something in there as a subject for fiction. And it also it also, because he's coming from Ireland to America, there's other dynamics there that, you know, through the last couple of centuries of the Irish experience abroad that I think are interesting to dig into. I'm in the early stages of that. I'm still reading around the history, but I think that's what I'll work on next. As a teacher, you say I'm a lecturer at Queen Mary, and in common with a lot of universities, we've shifted almost all our teaching online. So it's very familiar to be talking to people on a screen like this now. I don't know how long that'll continue, but I wouldn't expect that to change anytime soon. All I'll say is that in my experience, I don't know if some of you are teaching in the same way, some of the who are attending this session now, is that the students have been great. I'm workshopping student writing. Students present their work and we discuss it, and we give them feedback, and that's a tricky thing to do when you can't see people's faces and you're not getting much back in the traditional sense. So So yeah, that's ongoing, and I'm a part-time lecturer. That's sort of half my week, and the other half of the week is pretending to write.
Thank you. Well, look, thank you very much, Michael. That's all my questions. Can we throw open the floor? And as I say that, I see in the chat we have a couple of questions in the chat. So from Joan Semple, hi Joan. Joan says, as an actor, when you were writing, did you visualize it as translating to a different medium, for example, film?
You know, that's an interesting question. Thanks. I didn't directly, but it so happens, I've been teaching creative writing for a number of years at universities, and while I was writing Country, I was asked at quite short notice to take over teaching a screenwriting module. Someone had started teaching it and wasn't able to continue, and I had some background. My brother's a filmmaker, and I'd worked with him years ago, and I had some background in screenwriting, and they said, could you take this over? So I gave myself a sort of crash course again in screenwriting and the principles of that, and was teaching that for about a year alongside writing Country, as well as teaching an ordinary fiction class. So I have wondered in retrospect if some of that fed into the process of it, because it is a very, it's a very sort of stripped down narrative, and it uses the sort of thriller template in a sense. It's written in short chapters and in very kind of accessible demotic language, like a thriller, as a thriller often is. And in genre terms, I suppose I wanted it to be the sort of book that the characters who feature in it might enjoy, if you like. So I was thinking about, Westerns. I was thinking about that I grew up watching, you know, Sylvester Stallone films and Westerns, and the Iliad also, maybe at a couple of removes, but sits under all those stories too. The notion of the hero, the notion of glory, the notion of honor, that was fed through to me in another way. So it wasn't direct. I didn't intend to think this would make a film, but I think cinema was very often in my mind as I was writing.
Thank you. We now have a question from Leisha. Did you look to any other authors who had similarly used classics for Northern Irish allegory? And she also says this novel seems like it would make for a great 6-part drama.
Let me just have a look at similar use classics. Yeah, no, I didn't. People have brought that up. In particular, I've been asked a couple of times about Michael Longley and others. I didn't, and maybe for obvious reasons, I didn't want to have somebody else's version of this in my ears as I was attempting my own. There were other Irish writers. I read for the first time, having seen the film years ago, I read Patrick McCabe's novel, The Butcher Boy, in the early stages of writing this, and that unlocked something in the sort of voice, the sort of local voice I allowed myself to write in. But no, I didn't specifically look at other classical retellings. And in terms of the Iliad itself, I used a couple of translations. I started out with the Feigel's translation, and then found my way to, having shopped around a few others, I found my one.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, my internet is dropping in and out. We have another question, which I think you've just answered, from Stephen McCarthy. Favorite translation of the Iliad or the Odyssey? Mm-hmm. Irene says, is it possible to tell us without spoilers how you integrated the gods in the story?
Yes, for sure, because it's very obvious from early on, I think, in the story. The challenge, I think, with the gods for me was how, from the nature of the gods in Homer, whether that's true of Greek mythology in a wider sense. And I will give you my own version that I took away from the reading I did, and I'm happy to be shot down by anybody who's rightly going to tell me this is wrong. But is that they're not gods in the Judeo-Christian sense that we understand. Sure, they have supernatural powers, but so do some of the mortals, yeah? And they're very big, okay, yes. But the key to them, they're not the gods so much as the immortals. The point is they can't die, and we can. And that's what gives them their special status, and that's what that's the key difference, it seemed to me. And what's at stake for us is death, is life and death, and that isn't at stake for them. And that's why you get this weird slapstick quality to the scenes where they fight, because nothing's really at stake. They'll be fine. They'll get up and walk away, and they know they will. So I thought a lot about that, and I thought about those, particularly in Northern Ireland, also in the wider world, who, when there is an armed conflict going on, who do not put themselves in the line of fire, as it were, whose lives are not at stake. Now, in Northern Ireland, of course, politicians' lives were often at stake, but they weren't putting themselves out there as combatants, I mean. So they were controlling the destinies of those who would live and die on the basis of their decisions. And so it struck me that the political class, as it were, would stand in for the gods. So there's a sort of a voice who appears unnamed from London. There are various representations of politicians from Dublin and from the different parties in Northern Ireland, the different sides in Northern Ireland, who kind of occasionally quite crudely map onto the gods who take different sides in the Iliad, as it were. So that's it. The politicians stand in for the Olympians.
Okay, thank you. Patrick Bell says, would you say your book has great heroes? Because we think of the Iliad as a book portraying great heroes. And rightly or not, those involved in the Northern Ireland Troubles perhaps are not so often portrayed as heroes.
Yeah. I mean, I came to the Iliad without many preconceptions, not to the story of the Trojan War, but to the Iliad as a text. And when I dug into what's actually going on there, I struggled to find a lot of it heroic in the sense that I wanted to, maybe, or expected to, maybe. I mean, it is ludicrously violent. You know, the savage slaughter that takes place is, I had to tone it way down. People say my book is very violent. It doesn't go near the Iliad. And the tricky thing maybe for a modern reader, it seems to me, to tune into is that combination of savagery and glory, and finding glory in savagery and finding savagery in glory. And that's what I wanted to retain. So I wanted, through my novel, to make the reader think about these men's sense of their own heroism. It seems to me that those involved in the Northern Ireland conflict on both sides saw themselves as on the right side of history, saw themselves, however grubby their actions, as essentially heroic, as doing what needed to be done for a greater purpose, which would bring glory to them and their people in the longer run, and they would be remembered as heroes. And you know, you and I may struggle to tune into that, but I would insist that is how most of those people see themselves and saw themselves genuinely, authentically. And that's really what this book is for. I think if it's for anything, is to, and it's for me, you know, you write a book, or I write a book to undo a knot that I can't, to scratch an itch that's bothering me. And what was bothering me was how it was that people I was living among, probably most likely, were doing this and killing people. Absolutely, there's no clean way to kill people, you know, shooting people, blowing people up, and thinking they were doing something wonderful and glorious and heroic. How? And this book is my attempt to answer that for myself. On the other hand, if you think of the other way of looking at it, I suppose, is that if you take what happens in the Iliad on a human level, it's a pretty squalid falling out over a woman, you know, which has huge repercussions for thousands of individuals. So I know it's a very reductive reading of it, but that element I wanted to throw into the mix as well.
Okay, thank you. Right, John Curran asks, is there a sense in which the book is subversive? And John continues, one of the things that has emerged from the Troubles is a kind of folklore of violence. in country, it seems to John, the tales never escape the violence. Like the Iliad, it seeks to tell the terrible truth about what's really involved in being violent.
Yeah, good. I mean, that may be, I began to think about that in what I was just answering just now, but the folklore of violence, yes. What was also important to me is that this is a story told. You know, the Iliad is told about events that happened long before the telling, as it were. And this is not the same span of time, but we're listening to a voice telling us a story that, as the saying goes, has lost nothing in the telling. And we may not believe every word of it is literally true. Who can have access to all that side of things? But subversive, I suppose, only in the sense that I found myself, and I won't name names, but I found myself unsatisfied by a lot of the fiction I was reading that was addressing the Northern Ireland conflict. And if it was, I don't know if subversive is the right word. If you found it so, I'm delighted in a sense. I've no problem with that at all. But it was certainly trying to complicate people's understanding, and as I say, the make people see it through the eyes of those who it's quite hard maybe sometimes to empathize with.
Okay, thank you. Now our last question then is from Emily Greenwood, and she is asking about your sense of the absurd. She says, you mentioned humour in passing and the culture of humour in different parts of the UK and Ireland. She read Country and Anna Burns's Milkman back to back and was very struck by the use of dark humour and the absurd as a commentary on the flaws of the communities and protagonists. So could you say a bit about your sense of the absurd in the novel? Yes,
I will, certainly. And I think that probably, apart from maybe my own temperament and instincts, comes out of a lot of the reading I did. And I read a lot of first-person accounts, as I said, and a testimony of people who were involved. And while, like I said before, I think, and on both sides, there's an awful lot of memoirs and accounts left by soldiers who served in Northern Ireland, and there's a great novel to be written about that, which I haven't done. You know, I've touched on that, but there's extraordinary material there, which I would love someone to do, and maybe I'll have another look at that at some point. But I was essentially focusing on the Republican side. I'd lost track of the question. Could you remind me what it was?
The question was, could you say a bit about your sense of the absurd in the
novel?
The
absurdity, yes, thank you. And while those people took what they were doing very seriously, and as I say, saw themselves in a wider picture of historical import, I think on a day-to-day level, it is hugely absurd what you're doing. And there was an extraordinary level of strangeness. And when we think back now, when I try to explain to people in England, where I live, what it was like to grow up in Northern Ireland day to day, and you start thinking back to that. And occasionally I look at old photographs, or I look at old news, and it's extraordinarily strange what passed for everyday life. So the absurdity of that, the comedy of that, the ridiculousness. I didn't want to honor these characters. I wanted them to look stupid a lot of the time. I wanted them to look ridiculous. Sometimes they know it, sometimes they don't. And in how they see themselves, how they talk about themselves, and that goes on both sides. But I also wanted them to have the sort of fun I remember that there is among a group of Northern Irish people of the same age and background who get together, and it is expected that you make each other laugh before you do anything else. That's the first thing you want from an encounter with a group of friends, you know, in a way that isn't always the same in other parts of the UK. So that sort of almost competitive or instinctual, or you know, desire to be silly or to be funny or to be witty is felt to me very true to the time and place.
And we do have that very strange, very dark sense of humour here, don't we? Right, we have a comment from Joanne Brown just saying, after reading Milkman last summer, she's thinking how well Country will sit with that. And she has, I think you have got a few new readers here. She's going to order her copy. Very last question then. Peter Crawford, our own Peter, says, could your emigrating ancestor have gone on some sort of odyssey?
Well, he could. I think it's a different sort of odyssey, because the funny thing is, Helen, I don't want to hit this too hard at this stage of the game, but a great name in my family on my mother's side is Aeneas.
No.
It's a name appears in Ireland, you know, it crops up occasionally as a name in Ireland, but it's a family name on my mother's side. And the man I'm talking about's father was called Aeneas, and it's a name in the family. It's sort of associated with bad luck. Various Aeneases didn't turn out well in one way or another, so it hasn't come down to the current generation. But until a couple of generations ago, it was one of the recurring family names. So I have that in my mind as I think about that story, but I'm not going to do another retelling. Certainly, I feel I did that. Plus, you have to admit there's another Irish writer who had a pretty good crack at doing a retelling of the Odyssey, and I don't want to step onto that turf, you know.
Okay, thank you, and that's fascinating. How awesome to have an ancestor called Aeneas. Well, I guess we're just about out of time. We have answered all the questions. You've answered all my questions. Thank you so much, Michael, for giving us your time this evening. And I have changed my view back to gallery view, and I'm going to ask, I learned this at the weekend. Apparently a deaf round of applause is this. So can we all, if you have your camera on, can we give Michael a deaf round of applause? And thank you so much for joining us tonight, Michael.
Thank you very much,
everyone who has come along from all parts of the world. Wonderful to see you, and just thank you so much for being part of this CANI event. Good night, everybody.
Thanks so much for asking me. I enjoyed it very much. All the very best to all of you.
Thank you, Michael. We'll be in touch.